In the early days of a project, such as the one I'm working on now, I tend to jump around a little bit in terms of what I'm doing in terms of making components. So one day I'll be doing like the bed, which you've seen the video of, and I've just jumped recently into making the springs for the front of the vehicle. So here's one of the main springs. This is the top spring. You can see the small components just a second on the top there, which will be the spring hanger brackets, and then I've got the various springs leaves that you can see here. I mean, the front spring's got 6 leaves. It's actually supported on a secondary spring, so there is 2 springs associated with the front of the vehicle, and here are the components that I've made for those springs as well. You can see this spring again. I've put a small tube on the end, which will be where the spring hanger bracket goes. Just by way of divergence, this is a small bending machine that I made. I put that at the end there so that you can see it, which I use for bending the springs and getting the right profile of each of the springs, rather than trying to do it by hand, which works, but you don't get a nice smooth curve as you do using my little bending machine. So that's the first stage in making the springs. So here in this video you can see the rear springs, which I've now completed, or at least one of them. This is quite unusual in that it's got 3 leaves on the upper part of the spring, which actually wrap around the hole at the end here. So there's one of the springs of the 3. This is an 8-leaf spring. This being a truck, it's a lot heavier at the back, and that's now all of the spring components completed. I've now cut the 2 chassis longerons to size, and I spent the last few days making the various components by which the springs will be attached to the chassis. So the first one to notice is on the end here. You can see the front spring hanger, so the front spring will go in that. You can see the other one component on the other hanger, which is sitting next to it. So they're the 2 chassis rails which will form the base of the chassis. The back of the front spring is actually held onto the chassis by this component. So actually it goes that way up. I've yet to make the plate at the bottom, which will clamp the secondary spring onto this component, which is slotted so that it will then fit onto the chassis. The rear of the rear spring has this component, which I've made out of some brass material. You can see there are actually 2 of those, one for each side, and these go on the rear of the truck chassis in order to suspend the rear spring. And their counterpart is this unit, where the spring actually fits inside here, just inside there. You can see it's off centre so that the spring can get in, and there are 2 of those. So all the components necessary to support the spring on the chassis are now complete, with the exception of the short hanger bars, which I'll be making over the next few days. The chassis has a number of channel beams that go across to separate the 2 outer chassis rails, and I've been busy recently making those components. They're all made, well, they're all with the exception of one, a channel format. So what I've done here, for want of the regular material being available, is I've made the channel out of 2 pieces of 6x6mm angle iron, and then under that I've soldered these end plates which will be drilled to support these on the chassis. There are 2 which are 12mm, so those 2 which are the principal beams and actually sit behind the spring hanging brackets, and then there's 1 which is slightly smaller. This is a 10mm channel, and is actually used to support the rear differential, together with a round channel which will be used to support the sub chassis, or the rear of the sub chassis, once I've made that. The very front has a curved channel, so I've made the first piece of that channel. Probably later on today I will get around to soldering on some pieces to give it some depth, and it will end up like these, as a channel format once I've made those components. And this is at the very front of the truck, so that's what you see when you look at the front of the vehicle. In the last few days, I've fixed all of the components of the chassis to the 2 main chassis rails, as you can see here. So I'll bring this in a bit closer, you see it. So here's the rear spring hanger with this rear bearer. As you can see, it's the plates inside meet so that the screws go through both the bearer and the outer component. This middle plate doesn't actually have any outer components fitted to it, so you can just see the rounded round head screws on the outside. But you will notice there's these fixings here, and that's because this plate will actually be made with additional brass components to support the rear differential. And you've got similar support where the front of the rear spring goes, which is there, again with a 12mm channel. The circular component, which is on its own. The engine and gearbox sit in a sub chassis which sits underneath, and this circular component will be used in conjunction with some additional components to support the sub chassis, which is probably in the real car something like 8 to 10 inches below the level of the primary chassis. Here's the spring hangers for the rear of the front springs, and as I explained earlier, these front of the springs will be in here. What you can also see is this is the brass component that I showed in the earlier video. As you can see, I've added some brass plate to the top and the bottom and soldered that in place, so you've now got a good sturdy and solid component, and this is actually the very front of the vehicle if you exclude the springs. So that's the chassis complete. There will be some components to fit to it at a later date. So for example, if you take the bed of the vehicle, I'll just lay that there on the chassis. There are some brackets which are used to fix the wooden bed to the metal chassis, but I haven't made those yet, and once I get those made, I will fix them to the bed, do all of the work to drill the chassis in the appropriate places, but I won't fit that until later on into the project. So that's all for now. In my next video, I'll probably show you the completed springs fitted to the body, and possibly I will get around to making the front axle in the next few weeks. So hopefully watch this space and see what's next.